What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and today I've got my Week 15 rest of season running back rankings for you guys. I've got my top 24 players at the position, and the guys I see being the most beneficial in lineups here down the stretch of the postseason. As always, if you guys haven't already, make sure to join the SFS family by hitting the subscribe button, and make sure to turn that bell on as well so you guys are notified whenever I come out with a new video. But let's not waste any more time. Let's hit the intro and get into my top 24 for the rest of this season. Alright, getting things started off with my number 24 guy. Myles Gaskin is a player I really like here down the stretch, but is actually dealing with COVID right now and missed his Week 14 game. So obviously Gaskin, when he's on the field, is a workhorse type player, and we see him get a healthy amount of touches, but there is a chance we see him on the field this week, and if he's able to do so, he's got New England here, which just let up a massive performance to Cam Akers, and then he's got the Raiders the week after that. So Gaskin's got a really nice schedule. If he hits the field again, I feel great about his production going forward, but he's a little bit lower on the list just because of the uncertainty of whether or not he'll play in Week 15. Melvin Gordon comes in at number 23 here, just a slim margin ahead of Myles Gaskin, and Gordon is a guy who gets some very nice usage in that Broncos offense, and only gets the bump over Gaskin because I think it is a bit more likely we see him on the field this week. But nonetheless, Gordon is still questionable coming into this game, but it's just for some minor dings and bruises. But Gordon's a solid RB2 or flex play here down the stretch. The schedule isn't all that great, but when he finds the end zone, Gordon's a dependable play and a running back who deserves some lineup consideration. At number 22, I've got Raheem Mostert of the San Francisco 49ers, and Mostert has an ankle injury right now that is having some imaging done on it, so he lands a bit lower on my list here. Obviously, Mostert has shown flashes so far this season, but since returning to the field, he's been all but average. Mostert hasn't really been that impressive and only has nice production in his first game back when he scored a touchdown, but weeks 12 through 14, like I said, the numbers have been down. He hasn't quite been the same player as we saw earlier on in the first quarter of the season, so Mostert down on my list, but a guy who definitely has some flashes if he's able to come back to the field. But obviously there is some doubt about that with the ankle injury. At my number 21 spot, I've got Ezekiel Elliott, and to be quite honest, Zeke is only still on my list at this point in the season because of the volume and usage he gets in that Cowboys offense, but Zeke only 12 carries for 48 yards. The production and the ceiling is just not there anymore, and for the guy who was once a dominant RB1 in fantasy, I think Zeke has certainly taken a huge step back this year, and obviously Dak Prescott being out of the lineup doesn't help that much, but the schedule does not favor Zeke in that Dallas offense here. San Francisco, Philadelphia, and the Giants, not good matchups, all good fronts. So Zeke much lower on my list than he was at any point this season so far, and not a guy I'm thrilled about starting at any level. At number 20, I've got James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Conner's another guy who I'm not really excited about starting here the rest of the season. Only 10 carries for 18 yards in Week 14 in a double-digit loss to the Bills. And the Steelers, I just don't think believe in their run game at this point in the season. I mean, Conner is a touchdown-dependent play and not a guy being super efficient with his carries right now. So James Conner moving forward, I think, has a somewhat decent floor, but not a guy I see with a high ceiling at all. And he can definitely lay an egg like he did this week against the Bills. At number 19, I've got Wayne Gallman. And until we see Devontae Freeman come back into that lineup, and that's something I'm not even so sure we see here down the stretch, I really like Wayne Gallman in fantasy. And for a guy who's been so consistent since Week 7, even this down week against the Cardinals this week doesn't have me that concerned. I mean, it was a modest Week 14 performance, only 7.5 points in half PPR scoring, but in the games when he's been used as a bell cow and finds the end zone, this guy's been impressive in a borderline RB1 play, so Gallman for the time being is still a very dependable start for me and a guy I like in lineups the rest of this season. CEH comes in at my running back 18 here, and Clyde is a guy who finally had a decent touch performance here with 21 in the game against Miami here in Week 14. The schedule here is not great for Clyde, though. He's got New Orleans and Atlanta left on the schedule, and Atlanta is a very underrated team against the run, and New Orleans just let up its first 100-yard rushing performance in a long while to Miles Sanders, but it was mainly because of an 80-yard touchdown run that he had in that game. But nonetheless, I think Clyde will struggle in those games. What keeps him on the list here for me is obviously an uptick in volume, but also that receiving volume. So Clyde as a receiver is a very versatile threat in that offense. and I think a guy who can still put up nice fantasy numbers in PPR scoring, but Clyde, I think the floor is a little shaky, so I'm a little hesitant to put him higher on my list. Miles Sanders comes in at my running back 17 spot, and Miles is a guy I have loved all year long and then started to majorly hit the panic button on, but I think Miles Sanders finally has a salvageable season here with Jalen Hurts at the helm for that Eagles offense. Sanders had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against a very elite New Orleans Saints defensive front, and obviously the cherry on top was that 80-yard rushing touchdown. But Miles Sanders, we know how shifty he is, we know how explosive he is, and we know he's a dynamic player. If Jalen Hurts can limit the turnovers and keep that team in football games, the run game will be a more prominent part of that offense, and that benefits them as a whole greatly because Miles Sanders, with the football in his hands, does some very special things. And with Arizona and Dallas on the schedule here the next 2 weeks, I think Sanders is in for 2 big performances if this success continues for the Eagles offense. But I'm a little hesitant still, so he's a bit lower on my list for a guy who was formerly a top-end RB1 for me. I like his ceiling going forward, but I need to see one more game before I can truly trust him again in Week 16. Ronald Jones at my number 16 spot is a guy who I have loved in fantasy all season long and have been begging for Bruce Arians to just give him the workload and cut Leonard Fournette out of that offensive role. But finally, for whatever reason, Leonard Fournette was a healthy scratch against the Vikings, and Ronald Jones did what Ronald Jones does. He had 18 carries for 80 yards and a touchdown, and these are the things I expect from Ronald Jones going forward if he is a bell cow in that offense. You see on the screen, this guy is still young. He's got a lot of life left in those legs. Only 23 years old. I would love to see him be a workhorse next season. The schedule here down the stretch, he's got Atlanta twice and Detroit. So if we see these numbers and these touches from Jones going forward, I think he can creep into RB1 territory and be a very dependable play here with a super high ceiling. So I love Jones the rest of the year. Go out and start him. This guy deserves lineup spots and could win fantasy leagues. At my number 15 spot, Cam Akers absolutely soared up my board here in my rest of season rankings in Week 15 here. Obviously, with 194 yards from scrimmage against the Pats, he deserves some recognition. In the past 3 weeks, he has been that bell cow for Sean McVay's offense here. And the schedule going forward is great. He's got the Jets this week, then at Seattle and Arizona. I think those are all matchups when Akers has a very high ceiling. And going forward, this guy is only owned in 55% of leagues, so this guy's a league winner. I mean, you can go snatch him up off the waivers. I did so in a league, and I think he's going to be a highly productive player here. So I love Cam Akers down the stretch. I think this guy gives some juice to lineups, and is going to be a very dependable guy that's going to put up some really, really great numbers. Kenyan Drake is a guy at my number 14 spot who I've been low on all season. I've talked about how he's not the most efficient rusher in the world, and a guy who is a bit of a touchdown-dependent play. But the last 4 weeks, he's got 5 touchdowns. And I think that Kyler Murray injury to his throwing shoulder and the decrease we're seeing in that passing volume offensively and Kyler Murray's rushing value on option runs on the goal line and such is actually a blessing in disguise for Drake because he is seeing those goal line carries right now and he's being fed the ball. So Drake, I think, is a guy who can get it done here down the stretch. He doesn't exactly need the high-end yards per touch numbers to put up a nice day if he's able to fall in the end zone multiple times. So Drake's a guy kind of like here down the stretch, a decent RB2 option and a high upside one at that. I think you guys can depend on Drake here, and he might even go out there and be a staple for some lineups. DeAndre Swift again comes in at a high upside RB2 position on my list this week, and coming back against the Packers this week in a very advantageous matchup, he was able to be quite impressive, and I could tell they were using him sparingly. Obviously, coming off a concussion, they want to be careful with their young star running back. So Swift on 11 touches had 50 yards from scrimmage and a touchdown as well. I think going forward, his touches are going to go up and up again because he is that starter officially in that offense. So now that he's healthy, now that he's proved himself to that coaching staff again, that he can get the job done, I expect Swift to see an uptick in his volume, and a guy who I think is super dynamic, will get yards in the receiving game and on the ground, and even can finish off runs and get in the end zone. I love Swift the rest of the way and think he's a high-end RB2 play and can even creep into RB1 territory. Josh Jacobs comes in at my RB12 here, and obviously Jacobs is still dealing with that ankle injury, which is what's holding him down a bit on this list, because the Raiders want to use him as that workhorse in that offense, but right now with that ankle, they have to use him a bit more sparingly, and that really affects this whole football team. I mean, when Oakland doesn't dominate time of possession, that defense is on the field, and they are not a very strong unit. They've been getting fried lately, both through the air and on the ground. So clearly Josh Jacobs is the core of this football team and really the piece that makes it all work. So for the Raiders' sake, I hope Josh Jacobs is able to get healthy here and get things together, because I think he's a very great fantasy lineup piece, especially in standard leagues. And going forward, I think some teams could really use his production again. So Jacobs still a low-end RB1 for me. If he gets that volume back and can find the end zone, I think he's got some nice production value. Chris Carson is my RB11 here, and since returning from that injury, Carson has seen a bit of a dip in his volume, but he is still a guy finding the end zone. He's got 3 total scores in his last 3 games, 2 on the ground and 1 through the air. And I mean, the consistency is there. This guy has a nose for the end zone. He finds it on a consistent basis, and you can't really argue with the production here. So obviously he is a bit touchdown dependent, but he is finding it, like I said, on that consistent basis. So it's not something I'm terribly worried about here. The major red flag for me going forward is the scheduling here for the Seahawks. They are at the Washington football team this week, which has a very good front 7. Then he's got the Rams, and after that, the 49ers. So the schedule is a bit tough, especially up front in the front 7. If Chris Carson can find the end zone, though, I think he is still a viable lineup play in a low-end RB1. At RB10, I've got Jonathan Taylor, and this is a guy in back-to-back weeks one-upped himself and put up his best fantasy game of the season. Obviously, in Week 13, he had his best game of the year, and then he outdid himself again here in Week 14 with an excellent performance, 150 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns. But JT here, he is peaking at the right time of the year. We've been expecting this from him all season long, and I think right now is obviously in the fantasy playoffs the perfect time for a rookie and a very talented guy to be popping. And I love his matchup here in Week 15 against Houston. I think he is a top-end player this week and a guy that can go out there and win leagues. I mean, he does have Pittsburgh in Week 16, which is a red flag, but JT is running hot right now, and is a guy I think is going to be pretty hard to stop. David Montgomery is another breakout running back in my RB9 here for the rest of this season. And David Montgomery, like I said, on an absolute hot streak right now. 3 straight games of 22.5 points or more in half PPR scoring, and he is finding the end zone at will as of late. Montgomery's got the Vikings, the Jags, and the Packers here up on the schedule. So a cakewalk and a breeze in terms of opposing rushing defenses. So I love the schedule for Montgomery. This guy's very talented, and that rushing offense for Chicago is on point right now. I think Montgomery is an RB1 the rest of this season. Christian McCaffrey is my RB8 here for the rest of this season. And obviously, if Christian McCaffrey is on the field, he is a top 5 producer week in and week out. But right now, it's been one thing after the next in this fantasy season for Christian McCaffrey, and it's just one red flag after another. He hasn't been able to stay on the field. Only 3 games played for him so far, and we expected to see him back last week before he tweaked a quad. So first it was a shoulder, now it's a quad. McCaffrey just can't seem to quite get healthy this year. I mean, obviously he's an extremely talented player. If he can just get back on the field, this guy can go out there and be a savior for a lot of teams. James Robinson is my running back 7, and obviously this is a guy who is a workhorse for that Jacksonville team. But last week, I think we finally saw that ugly floor for those Jacksonville offensive players affect Robinson's fantasy value. I mean, the Jags were whooped by 3 touchdowns in favor of the Titans, and they were just not competitive in that game. Obviously, Robinson saw his touches, but I think we saw that when the Jags are not in the contest, they're not going to be able to run the ball as effectively, and that is going to majorly impact Robinson's value. The Jags did go back to Minshew at the end of the game, and things started to look a little better, but the schedule is a little bit tough here. He's at Baltimore next week, then Chicago and Indianapolis to finish things out this season. So I think both the ceiling and the floor are down a little bit right now for James Robinson, but he is still an RB1 in my book. At my RB6 spot, I've got Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers, and Ekeler is one of the most dynamic players in fantasy football and one of the best backs out of the backfield as a receiver. And for Justin Herbert, he is invaluable as a safety blanket. And going forward, I think Ekeler has a pretty decent schedule here. He's got the Raiders in Week 15. That team has been atrocious defensively as of late. The running game has been a killer for them, and so is the passing game, and Ekeler does both very well. And then he's got Denver Week 16 and the Chiefs in Week 17. Those are all games Ekeler can have significant value and be a high-end fantasy producer. So I love Ekeler's numbers here going forward. Like I said, being a super dynamic player, this guy has a safe floor, and I think the talent is there. Ekeler is a great end RB1 here the rest of this season. Aaron Jones comes in at my running back 5 here for the rest of this season, and I strongly considered putting Austin Ekeler ahead of him here, but Jones in his own right is still a very explosive player and a guy who is very efficient with the rock in his hands, and a guy who racks up a nice amount of touches and rushing yards, as well as a guy who can get it done through the air. But the main thing that I think is lacking from Aaron Jones' game right now is what he excelled at most in 2019, and that is high-end touchdown production. I mean, the touchdowns have been going to Rodgers this year, and Jones just hasn't been finding that goal line work, but the scheduling here is great down the stretch. We saw Aaron Jones pop for a 77-yard TD against the Eagles in Week 13, so the burst is still there. I think Jones can get it done and have a really nice fantasy game here week in and week out the rest of the season. He's got Carolina, and then he's got the Titans and the Bears here to finish things off. I think Jones can have some very solid production games in those contests and be a top-end RB1 here down the stretch. So, hoping for the best from Aaron Jones, but I wouldn't be surprised if in a week, if he's not able to find the end zone, if Ekeler or another top-end back is ahead of him on the list. Nick Chubb comes into my running back 4 spot for the rest of this season, and Chubb is becoming a guy who I think is becoming a borderline must-start player, a sit-and-forget type player that regardless of the team on the other side of the ball, you put in your lineups anyway. I mean, there's nothing that's really a huge threat to his value down the stretch of this season, but against the Ravens in Week 14, a matchup I was a bit concerned about, he excelled at a high level and absolutely went off against that team. Multiple scores, hit a nice yardage total as well, and for a guy who fumbled the football against them and had a quiet day in Week 1, when he played them the first time around, he completely bounced back and improved a drastic level. So Chubb here, the schedule is not that tough, like I said. He does have the G-men, that's a solid front, but he can get it done. He got it done against Baltimore, so a huge vote of confidence for me there. And then the Jets in Week 16, I think, are another good matchup. So Chubb going forward, obviously a top-end start. I would not hesitate one bit to put him in my lineup. Dalvin Cook rounds out the back end of my top 3 at the running back position here. And obviously anyone who cracks the top 3 is an elite level starter at the position. But Cook here, I think, is seeing a bit of a dip in his ceiling right now. He's got some really tough matchups here, but we saw him produce, and he's got an extremely safe floor. I mean, over 100 yards and a touchdown against Tampa Bay, one of the better run stops in the league. So I think that gives you some confidence as a lineup owner going into Week 16 against the Saints, who is also a very stout unit against the run. But Cook, like I said, he's going to get his touches. This guy's explosive, and he will find the end zone, it seems. So Dalvin Cook, obviously sitting for get territory right now. Top-end starter, but the ceiling is down slightly, so he's a little down on my list as well, just because of those matchups, like I said. Alvin Kamara comes in at my running back 2 spot, and I think something for Alvin Kamara owners to celebrate big time here is that he saw a season-high reception total with Taysom Hill at the helm here with 7 grabs for 44 yards. That's the best by far that he's had with Hill as the starter in that lineup. And obviously, Breeze is a prospect of return here in the regular season. The Saints are going to make the playoffs, so we will see Breeze back at some point this year. But New Orleans stated they are not in any hurry to get Breeze back on the field. So I think Hill's performance in Week 14 with Kamara is a very big confidence booster here going forward. And especially in PPR leagues, that gives Kamara a ton of value, and that's where he has thrived all year long. So if we do end up seeing Hill here as the starter the rest of the regular season, I think that Kamara is going to be quite okay. I mean, 7 grabs is more than enough to get the job done. He also found the end zone as well, so I feel really comfortable with Alvin Kamara the rest of this year. And then Derrick Henry here, once again, my running back 1 for the rest of this season. And between Henry and Devontae Adams, it has not changed once here for me in the last month or so. Adams, for me, it's been the whole season. He's been my wide receiver 1, but Derrick Henry here the last 4 or 5 weeks has been my running back 1 each and every single time. It's something you don't even really have to think about. I predicted either multiple 200-yard games for Henry here down the stretch or multiple 2+ touchdown games. He did it both in one game. He had 215 and 2 scores against the Jags. Detroit, Green Bay, and Houston, those are cakewalks in terms of rushing defenses for Henry to deal with the next 3 weeks here. So Derrick Henry, an elite level start. I think he's going to be a back-to-back rushing title champion here. So Henry is going to be huge for fantasy lineups. And if you've got this guy, you're in a great spot to win your league. Those were my top 24 running backs for the rest of this fantasy football season. If you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel and turn that bell on so you guys are notified whenever I come out with a new video or go live for a fantasy Q&A. So thanks again so much as always for watching. Remember, if you have any questions, put those in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to answer all of you guys and give you the best input that I have. So thanks so much. I'll see you next time. Peace out.